This is the video for week 9 of class, chapter 6 from Disciples of All Nation on West Africa. I'm going to go through the sections one by one as usual. The first section is called Seeking a Better World, and I ask you the questions of how African problems implicated not only Europeans but also African politics and religion. And the fact was that many Africans, it was becoming very clear to them as they were going through some of the sufferings related to the slave trade, colonialism, that their old gods seemed to have failed, that their old culture seemed to have failed. Even the old chiefs, their old political system failed. It was the chiefs that allowed the slave raiding of the neighboring chief countries, of the neighboring tribes and countries and peoples. We talked about before how the chiefs were put in a very hard spot, how they had to almost participate in the slave trade for short-term benefit, even though they knew it was a long-term disaster. And after generations of this, it was very clear that there was a problem. And so they were looking for something new. They were looking for something new that could bring them a new society, a new answer when their old gods, like I said, like their old religion, seemed to be failing, and the spiritual forces even that propped up their religion. In Africa, as in many countries, religion and politics are often tied together. And this was the case. And so Christianity seemed to promise them a new and better world. The This could be in a harsh way sometimes, and then also in a more gentle way. So two examples that the book gives, I think, that kind of encapsulated two stories. Now, the story of one African preacher who chose a spot that had been cursed by the old gods, by the old spirits, and specifically chose that spot and told all the people in the village to come and burn their religious items, their magic items, their fetishes, their charms, their idols there at the spot that had been cursed, kind of in open defiance. You know, like, you think this space is cursed, I will show you how powerful the Christian God is. I will burn all of the items used in your worship right here on this spot. So very confrontational. Then there's a little more gentle one of a man who was driving a steamroller literally through a village to make a new road and heard a woman lamenting and came to recognize, we need to save the old ways in a way. And he became a Christian preacher to help this in impartial response to this old woman's call, to help bring in a new order, a new religion where the young are not against the old, where the young are not literally steamrolling the old, but where young and old together can live in harmony. And that for him was Christianity. So you can see these two kind of ways of thinking about the new replacing the old. So the African choice to take Christianity when the old ways seem to be inadequate. Now we have Garrick Breide and Babalola, Joseph Babalola, for two different African preachers whose lives in some ways are very similar. Both of them uh, have some influence from the missionaries, have learned Christianity, but then take the message and make it far more successful than the missionaries ever were. They each gained tens of thousands of converts, become the head of these major movements that still dominate Christianity in these areas in West Africa. Both of them are picking up on clues or on key parts of Christianity that the Europeans are leaving out. Their version of Christianity includes spiritual power, includes casting out evil demons, includes healing, especially, which is probably the highest point, in a period with 1918 flu pandemic and other pandemics, other health crises that are coming because of these movements of peoples. They're offering solutions, they're offering cures through holy water, through praying, through healing, divine healing, what's called divine healing. And so, and they gather people through this authority, this kind of charismatic authority, through their speech and through their actions. They convince people that they have this power to bring in health and the things that people are seeking from their religion. And they also, so they really bring the Christian message into an African language, so to speak. They really bring it in a way that Africans can understand. One big difference is the colonial response. So where Breide, one of the things he preaches against is alcohol, which is ravaging Africa, which is a very destructive, from a public health perspective. Alcohol is a very damaging kind of drug. And Breide is aware of this, and he's preaching against this. And and the British make most of their money from alcohol sales, alcohol taxes, and so he gets thrown into jail, and so he encounters direct opposition to his Christian message. Even though, of course, from a community perspective, what he's doing is helpful. He's helping people get out of alcoholism and escape its kind of destructive effects. Babalola, on the other hand, he has Western admirers, partly because the timing is different and partly because his message doesn't impact tax revenue so directly. Some American charismatic teachers see in Babalola the same things they've been talking about, because Americans too are talking about spiritual powers, about divine healing, about the inadequacy of traditional religion, this kind of God stays in church once a week, maybe at most on Sundays, and well-behaved kind of Christianity. They like the Christianity that's more felt, that has the power to invade your life, that has the power to heal, to do the things, to interact in the spiritual world. And then the last character in this next section we'll talk about, called Coastal Surge. He really dominates the rest of this chapter, and is probably the most influential out of these three figures. Is a man named William Wade Harris. And in this section called Coastal Surge, we see how he gets started, and how the Europeans reacted, more or less. So Harris is a fascinating figure. He was already involved in a number of revolutions, already jailed a couple times before he hears the message of God to preach. And he already was a Christian, but this seems to be a turning point in his life, from political revolution to a spiritual preacher, to a prophet, really. What he would call himself is a prophet. And it came not in an ordinary way. He was not a prophet because he went to prophet school, or he got a prophet degree, or someone even told him. He had a dream, and God told him, "You are a prophet. It will require the sacrifice of your wife. You will get 6 shillings, a small amount of money. You will never need more. Tell them how to dress, what to say," and spoke to him through the angel Gabriel. So really authorized in his mind directly by God, um, and in accordance with everything he saw. His wife did die, and his wife, apparently before she died, had a similar dream, a parallel dream, confirming, "Yes, I will die, but you are going to be released as a prophet." And he walked around with a white turban, white robes, a simple cross and a Bible, speaking this message. And that authority was seen in his effectiveness. You could see he really believed, whether or not, whatever he experienced. Of course, it's impossible to know, but he really believed he was from God, and he spoke that way. And the Europeans responded. Some of them accepted his message, but a lot of them opposed him. And in fact, the French were so worried, because they were trying to cement their control over Ivory Coast, which is where he was, that they eventually arrested him and then even banished him. So he had to go to Gold Coast, the neighboring British colony. And so that's the basic beginning of Harris's kind of ministry, his work of prophethood. And Prophet in Profile, this next section, we kind of see people starting to take advantage of his message. He converts hundreds of thousands of people. So this is really, when you see this kind of linchpin. West Africa is the most densely populated region of Africa. So a huge amount of the population is concentrated in this, around this coastline, and in this delta, the Niger Delta, modern day countries of Nigeria, the most populous country in Africa. And so especially sub-Saharan Africa. There are other population centers in North Africa, especially Egypt, but in sub-Saharan Africa, it's really this area. And why is it Christian? So before Harris and Breida and Babalola and some of these other teachers, it was largely African kind of indigenous primal religions, or the traditional religions of Africa and Islam. And into this steps these figures, and that's really what converts them. This is one reason we're talking about it still, because the future of Christianity seems that Africa will continue to grow in the world, in population, eventually probably overtaking Asia as the most populous continent, and it will be largely Christian, partly because of these kind of figures. So people were taking advantage of his success, and not in a necessarily a negative way, but sometimes. Foreign European missionaries would claim that Harris told his followers to follow them, and then local African kind of smaller prophets would also try to take his following, because he did all this in only a few months. It was only about 3 months. He swept through, really like a wind or a storm, and just hundreds of thousands of people converted. And then basically he had a stroke. He was banished. Then he had a stroke, and he kind of ended his preaching career. But in the aftermath, all these people are scrambling to try to take control of his followers. And some of his success is simply the simplicity of his message. As he said, destroy the old religion, don't have anything to do with it, behave in a moral way, and be saved. Basically, it was very simple for people to understand, and he spoke it with kind of authority. And he led the local people. Importantly, this is one reason he had such a long-lasting effect, and kind of a diverse effect. And one reason that people took advantage, so to speak, but not really, is that he simply told his followers, "Go find Christian teachers. After I'm gone, I'm here just as a prophet to warn you, to make you Christian. Then hang around, create Christian communities, and wait. Someone will come to teach you." So this is why European and African teachers came to fill in the void. Some of them kind of probably craftier or with ulterior motives, but some of them very genuinely trying trying to help these people and bring then the Christian teaching that Harris himself had promised. In Cultural Matrix, this is a fascinating section where we think about what it means. Why did Harris succeed? What it means that he succeeded? What are the takeaways? What can we understand about the kind of Christianity of the future? And again, like I said in the last section, what's true for Africa really is true for Asia and Latin America. We'll spend a little time on Asia. Unfortunately, in this class, we won't have time really to go in detail in Latin America. But a lot of the same things are there. The legacy of colonialism, indigenous and native culture, or home culture versus abroad culture. And you can see these patterns happening in Africa. You can see them happening in Latin America, and you can see them happening in Asia. And what I mean to say by this is that Christianity had come for a long time clothed in the matrix, clothed in matrix means like a weaving and interweaving this by moving my hands like this. There's a kind of a whole system, a whole cultural system that comes with Christianity. It seemed to be civilization. For a long time, the Europeans, when they preach Christianity, they seem to be preaching something like better roads, like good schools, like becoming European in a way. And what is very clear with Harris's success is that there are a lot of people who accept better roads, who like good schools and things like that, and have nothing to do with Christianity. I mean, those are separate values from Christian values. And then conversely, this is kind of Harris's case. There are a lot of people who accept Christianity and are illiterate, for instance, who do not adhere to European standards of hygiene or roads or bureaucratics or hierarchies and schooling and these kind of things. A lot of Harris's followers are illiterate, and they still embrace Christianity. So Christianity is getting disentangled from this cultural matrix, this European cultural matrix. And then specifically in terms of Africa, it becomes very clear that Islam, like I said, this area is dominated by Islam, and before Islam and other religions, basically African primal religions. And what happens is that now it's dominated by Islam and Christianity. And why? To some extent, Harris was able to use the prestige or the language of Islam, the cultural language of Islam, to preach his message. When he was dressed in a white turban and white robes, that's the dress of a traveling Islamic preacher. These people are common. They're preaching the Quran. They're teaching the Arabic way of life. They're also not Arabic, sorry, the Muslim way of life. They're often using Arabic, to write charms. Arabic words from the Quran that are thought to have some sort of magical or spiritual power to ward off illness, to provide a good harvest. They charge a small fee for these kind of things. They pray over people. They give them these talismans. They'll eat from the same dish, live with these people. And so Harris really is borrowing that, but in a Christian way, right? He's using the Christian God, the Christian Bible, and he's not charging money. This is important too. He's offering a lot of these same cures and powers without charging money, but he is not culturally aloof the way the missionaries are. The missionaries, some missionaries saw this ahead of time. They said, we should really preach like the Muslims do. We should have our simple people just go out without a missionary body, without wearing fancy European clothing, and they would dip in the same bowl and eat with the people. That was something Harris was able to do, but that most European missionaries really did not or would not do. And that was part of the secret to his success. He was not above them, but he spoke in their language with an authority. He had authority, but he was not condescending or from another culture. He spoke from within the culture with that power. And so this next section on where others sowed, this talks about how Africans came to see how, again, to continue the last point, how civilization is not really tied to Christianity. The clearest case is that civilization, for instance, in the case of South Africa, led to thousands of dead Zulus. Led to war. Civilization meant British guns, and in some cases in Africa, in the harshest sense, something akin to genocide. And so, clearly, if that's civilization, that cannot be tied into a Christian message in a way that Africans would want to receive it. To receive Christianity is to be murdered by civilization. That couldn't be possible. And so, really, Africans had to take control of this Christianity. And these Harris's followers, you could see this taking of control. Again, in some pretty, we have two kind of cases, I think, that kind of flesh out how they managed to take control of the message and leave it in African culture without embracing European civilization, without embracing what they saw as clearly had some harmful effects. And one of these is the case of a Catholic bishop who came to visit a village full of Harris's followers. And the bishop, first they wanted to throw their clothes on the ground to welcome the bishop because the bishop is a chief. In their understanding, in the African understanding of chief, this bishop is surely a chief. He has authority even over the priests. And the bishop, because of his own cultural kind of hang-ups or background, refuses to walk on their clothes. So eventually they carry him up. This is the compromise. They still force him. He can't walk into the village. A chief cannot simply walk into a village in African understanding. And this again shows this distance, this cultural distance. But the way the Africans kind of took the message their own, they forced him. They more or less compelled this bishop to be carried like a chief into their villages. And it's a good kind of symbol for like their acceptance of European Christianity, but they're forcing it to be on their own terms in a way. They're making it African. So the message is not in the end European. I mean, the message of Christianity begins, as you probably know, with Jews in the first century in Palestine, and has traveled all over the world. And in fact, it was in Africa before it. Probably it was in Europe. And still, what we have is this way that Africans have of rejecting European civilization but Africanizing it, even when they accept the European as teachers. So these are Harris's followers. They accept a Catholic bishop as their leader because Harris told them, it doesn't matter whether they're Catholic or Protestant, just go and find the teachers will come to you. And then in a case of rejection too, we still see Africans taking control of their destiny. And we see this in another case where there was a missionary here, a Protestant missionary, who came to a Harris village full of Harris's followers and basically kind of demanded or expected to be treated as the teacher. He said, I'm the teacher who's been sent. And people just completely flat out rejected him. They just said, they even threatened him with retribution, even though he threatened them. Even though this missionary threatened them, I will get the British guns on you. I will tell people that you need to obey me. They just said, look, you don't speak for us. This white man does not speak for us, does not own the message of Harris. And so that's a pretty clear case, too, of this kind of Christianity, this African Christianity being genuinely African, being cut off from the European trappings, from European civilization, from European politics. And so this is where others sowed. This is referring to kind of a famous passage in the Bible where Jesus says, some will reap where others sowed. So some people put down the seed and others will pick up the harvest. Harris obviously laid this groundwork, and not everyone was able to sow from it, to take back from it, to reap from the harvest. And another aspect that Harris's kind of success illuminates for us studying world Christianity, for us trying to understand Christianity in the world today, is how he overcame the kind of inadequacy of the European message. Specifically, we can see this in these two examples. One is with regard to fetishes, which are these kind of talismans or objects of power associated with the traditional African religions. And the other one is related to healing, which is a key part of African religious culture, which was tied into the spiritual beliefs, to the religions, to the pantheons, the gods, the ancestors, and the spirits that made up African traditional religion. And what we see here basically is that the missionaries simply told the people to give up their fetishes, and when they did, they sometimes would listen. They would burn them and destroy them, but then they would just create them again. They would go and find them again, create them again, dig them up again, and it happened again and again, this kind of cycle, because the Europeans never gave them, in their mind, a fitting answer to fetishes. The European answer was simply, oh, this is superstitious, get rid of it, it doesn't exist. But that is an entirely different mindset. That's a mindset that really the African world is full of spirits, and frankly, actually, the world of the Bible, according to some readings, is also full of spirits. And so now Harris's message really helped them in that sense. And his answer was baptism. He said, the moment you get baptized, no fetishes have power over you. You have entered a new spiritual world. Your new spiritual authority and power are higher than that of the fetishes, and you cannot be touched by them, and you cannot participate in them anymore. So this helped these Africans get rid of the fetishes once and for all, because Harris offered an answer that was, again, on their level. Instead of saying they just don't exist, there's no spiritual world, he said baptism has a spiritual power. Baptism has a Christian baptism, which is the kind of the rite, the ritual of immersing someone in water. He claimed that this is the way that Christians deal with fetish power. And similarly, the European answer to healing was, well, this is all superstitious, right? These doctors, these medicine people, these spiritual healers, shamans and warlocks, witches, these kind of people with the abilities to do a spiritual healing. It's all a lie. You just take medicines and pills and believe in hospitals and science. And this is not Harris's answer, really. This again like empties out, hollows out human health in a way. Actually, in a way that, in some ways, the West is coming back around to this. There's a lot of discussion now in medicine about sensitivity to religious traditions, to belief, to the whole person. There's an understanding, for instance, the placebo effect is based on belief, and that belief can be a powerful. There's a psychosomatic issues in a lot of healing and health. But the point here is just that Harris refused to empty it out. These people, the Africans, were very used to thinking of healing in terms of a spiritual and religious significance, and to simply say it didn't exist was too radical a step. It was hard for them to accept, and a lot of them would continue to use these healers. And Harris offered a different answer. He just said, pray while you prepare medicine, pray while you take the medicine, pray in every step of the medicine, so that it was still filled with kind of a religious power. But now, of course, it's the Christian God that's being prayed to, or Jesus, and that is the power that's in the medicine that makes the medicine work. And so this kind of in a way is not so different from an answer that a certain kinds of this is the way that charismatic this charismatic Western Christian influence, this charismatic African influence, Latin American has come into our world too. In America, you might have people who are similar, actually, whether they're Catholic or Protestant, thinking about Western medicine the same way. Pray when you take the pill, pray when you go to surgery, right? But both, and it's not that you reject Western medicine, but it's that you add on a spiritual component to again, like I said, in some ways, medicine is coming to see this kind of whole person as part of the healing process. And Harris's message partly is so powerful. Again, we have to think about in this section, this one-sided story section. His message is so powerful because of all the changes, because there are rapid changes, because his partly why he gets arrested is because the French are trying to increase their colonial power in Ivory Coast, and they are changing the traditional ways more than ever. They're disrupting the ancient ways of life, the chieftain system, the old religions, the old customs, old languages, and people sense there's changes. People cannot escape the changes that are happening, and there's a kind of a fear that many people go through when there's times of cultural upheaval and change. And Harris addresses that. He says, basically, look, you're going to be destroyed unless you convert. So this is an answer that they can understand on their own terms, right? And this is really important to see. Like, I think a lot of times in a critical sense, people criticize Christianity in other countries. They skip a number of the steps in between and simply say, basically, the missionaries came, threatened the people, worked with colonialism, and the people were forced to convert. And what we actually see when we study is a much more complex situation. The missionaries mostly failed. Very few people were listening to European missionaries. They were there for decades with little success. Who they listened to was another African. They listened to an African who understood their culture, lived in their culture, spoke from their culture, from their primal religions, spoke from Islam, African Islam, spoke from these kind of cultural matrices, and convinced them, spoke that kind of message that was actually happening, whether they liked it or not. And as an antidote, in a way, a resistance or a method of offering hope in the face of colonial power. And this colonial power, in most times, in the most intrusive and destructive ways, was not so much religious, which again, they could refuse. You could reject a missionary. The missionaries were not the ones with bayonets that you could not refuse. What you could not refuse is the political and economic power of Europe, which was forcibly opening markets, forcibly changing new ways of farming, from subsistence to cash crop for export into the colonial power, with guns, with gunships, with soldiers, with weapons. And so this is where Christianity comes out of, but it's not as simple a story as, again, I think it's important to keep it's important to keep clear who the figures are and what choices they're making in order to honor the agency of everybody along the way. It's not that, the white man comes at the point of the bayonet to impose Christianity. In fact, we don't have cases of that. Christians have never considered it an authentic conversion when it's forced. It has to be voluntarily chosen. And so mostly they just failed. The Europeans just didn't get their message across. What did happen was European guns were there, and there were European bayonets, there were guns, but they were there for markets. They were there for political power. Sometimes they even favored Islam or primal religions. But even despite this, Christianity grew out of Africans' own choices as a way to resist and deal with or cope with these kind of extreme changes. Sorry. In the next section, religion and the irrational, we kind of meet this head on. One of the issues that the Europeans have is how to deal with the evil in the world. Africans ask a lot of questions. If I convert, what about the demons? What about Satan's power? You tell me about this evil spirit Satan. In African kind of demonology or cosmology, in traditional African cosmology, there are usually good spirits and evil spirits. There are good ancestors and bad ones, or good and powerful forces that battle. And Africans are very concerned with evil, especially because they're suffering, especially because they're undergoing rapid change. They really want an answer to these things, and European missionaries in general are not offering them. On the contrast, though, in contrast, a lot of the African Christians themselves, the ones who actually convert and create theologies from and for Africans, they address this head on. So we have this Apostle Oniya from Ghana, who is quoted extensively in this section, Religion and the Irrational. And he's basically suggesting, look, there's a fear of curses, there's a fear of evil spiritual forces. And he points out to become a Christian is to recognize that undeserved curses no longer have power. So if someone wants to curse you just purely out of jealousy, just because they hate you, you don't need to fear that as a Christian. You have the power over them, and he has the scriptural proof in Proverbs about undeserved curses flying away. And then how about deserved curses? What if you do something actually wrong? What if you mess up and you cheat on your someone in a relationship and they decide to curse you? Now what? You deserved it. You cheated. Well, he has this idea. This apostle points out again, he doesn't just dismiss this world of evil and curses and spiritual power. He addresses it head on. He says, well, yes, there are deserved curses. The root of it, again, is a very Christian answer. It goes back to Adam for him, and the first curse, which God cursed Adam because of disobedience. So the Christian answer, again, in a way, is very, it gives people handles for managing evil spiritual power. Instead of saying evil spiritual power doesn't exist, there's an answer to it, right? If you are rightfully cursed, then just obey God. It is because of your disobedience. Go back to obedience with God, and God will remove the curses and the power of the curses on you. And this also deals in a lot of ways, actually, with the practical evils, the material evil. So there's spiritual evils of curses and Satan and demons, which can be dealt with according to African theology, according to these African theologies, by obedience to God, and belief in God's power. And the material evils can also be dealt with. What about the colonizers who are coming again with the guns, with the suffering for the African people? What can they do? Again, the belief in God's spiritual power and ultimate moral authority in a way trumps the European command of material power. It promises that God treats all people as equal, that God does not care who has the most machine guns or the most money, that God treats every human being as equal, and that if they have faith and hope, God will overcome the evils also. So you can see, again, how this can be a means of independence, a point of pride for Africans, a way for them to take control of their destiny, given the fact that Europeans have already come with their guns, with their domination, with their markets. Africans can respond by saying they have the ultimate moral authority, they have faith. In the end, they will overcome, they will form their own nations, they will establish themselves as a people. And the last section is called Awakening in Weakness, which kind of gets at the same question we've been talking at from another angle, and really suggests that one reason the missionaries failed is because they were too powerful. They were too connected to these global markets. They had relatively a lot of money and authority in these situations. They had access to these hierarchies and structures that worked a lot better. Bureaucracies work a lot better than these oral traditions in which you argue over who has the right to become the next chief, right? In a lot of ways, it's very easy when you have tests and classes and ways to regularize succession. But that made them a little bit like angels in the human world. If angels tried to exist and tried to tell human beings about religion, one response, sometimes people think, well, well, we would believe if we saw shining beings flying among us, telling us the truth. But another sense would be, what do angels know about human sufferings? What's the point? Any angelic religion, if you could consider it, would have very little to do with human beings, with our heartbreak, with our pandemics, with our quarantining and social distancing and all these kind of problems. What could an angelic religion do? And in some ways, you can think about these missionaries as being almost like angels among the Africans. They could not understand. Their strength blinded them in a lot of ways to the power of the message that they actually had. Their message was too much. Just trust in our material. If you join us, you too will be civilized, powerful, have good cars, have planes, have lots of money. when the actual message was in a way even more subversive or powerful than that. If you join us, you will have the Christian gospel doesn't necessarily promise not no suffering, but it promises transcendence or a moral power that that goes through human suffering, that gives it meaning and allows you to overcome whether you suffer or not. And so this kind of relative weakness of the other Africans was what helped them give the message to their fellow Africans in a way they could accept and in a way that was meaningful to them. And the followers of Harris, you could see that they really embodied this message and followed their leader by walking a pretty fine line. Harris did not resist, did not start a revolution, even though he had been involved in revolutions before his Christian career, before he became a prophet. After he was kicked out by the French, after he had hundreds of thousands of people following him, he could have easily started a new revolution, but instead he basically allowed the French to arrest him, and he left the Ivory Coast. He went to, like I said, he went to the Gold Coast, and he obeyed the French authorities more or less. And so it showed that African Christianity was not going to be caught in a cycle of fear and retribution. It was not. It was going to be again like Jesus's message of turning the other cheek, a Christianity that was based in forgiveness, that was based on transcendence, that was nonviolent. And also, you can see that his followers didn't take another kind of common temptation. They had to walk this fine line of not accepting or authorizing the evils of colonialism, but neither resisting them through force of arms and also not retreating into kind of a utopianism, as Sana says. A lot of Christian groups have, you could say, fallen prey, or you could say, follow this path of this temptation to simply withdraw from the world. The world is evil, so we won't have anything to do with it. Well, if you do that, then you cannot engage anymore with the actual stream of life. You become, this is kind of like the Amish option or the monastery option. You withdraw behind the walls and cut yourself off from the world. But Harris's followers continued to engage in the world. They were not judgmental. They were not perfectionists, criticizing other people's religion or feeling like only one very specific, very perfect form of Christianity is the right one. They engaged the world as it was, and they tried to create a better future for their people with hope, with this Christian message, and yet without violence, and without this kind of prejudicial utopianism, without hiding in unrealistic kind of castles in the sky. And so this is Harris's effect on Africa. This is the lecture for this chapter.